At the Cato Institute.
Senior fellow at the Cato Institute.
William Niskanen, the chairman over at Cato, has a brand new book out, Reflections of a Political Economist.
He's at the Cato Institute.
Joining us next is Robert Levy. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute.
Economist with the Cato Institute.
Titled The Cult of the Presidency, and it's published by the Cato Institute.
Roger Pilon of the Libertarian Cato Institute says,
whose business is it? People have to be free to run their own businesses, because if they're not, they could find themselves going out of business in the blink of an eye.
Well, we're referring again to Gore's speech where he said that we can produce all of our electricity from solar energy, windmills, and geothermal in 10 years. That's crap. I mean, I don't use words like that, when I'm talking to the media, but that's crap. There is no way that can happen.
We don't have the capacity to do it. It's bad for the environment, and it makes just about everything more expensive. And what's not to like?
I first met David back in 1976 when he thought he was a conservative. And he and I got into a few political debates. And I finally said, David, you're not a conservative. And he said, why not? And I said, because you think too logically.
David Bose is the author of Politics of Freedom, taking on the left, the right, and the threats to our liberty.
You also see John McCain, who really doesn't like freedom of speech, and Rudy Giuliani, who's got an authoritarian streak a mile wide. Huckabee in Arkansas sent report cards home on whether your children were too fat. In the face of that, I publish a book called The Politics of Freedom, taking on the left, the right, and threats to our civil liberties. Well, where's an example of a successful libertarian society? And I tell people the answer to that is very easy. The United States of America.
But substantively, I think it was interesting, and within the ceasefire that was brokered, there were some provisions that were drafted that were very, very sympathetic to the Russian position.
It's somewhat anticlimactic because it simply formalizes the political reality in Cuba over the past year and a half, in which his brother has basically been running Cuba with Fidel's blessing. And so you can't quite say that this is the end of an era, but it does point to the end of an era.
That drives up the cost of insurance and contributes to our uninsured problem. And so, we see this over and over again in the healthcare sector, where whenever the government gets involved, that involvement ends up getting hijacked by the special interests and serving them rather than patients.
The notion that somebody can take a gamble, get a subprime loan, get an adjustable rate mortgage, and that they can bet their money and they can get all the upside if their house appreciates in value, but that I'm supposed to pay the downside if their house doesn't go up in value? I mean, you are really setting up a very perverse incentive structure in our economy if you have that kind of system where losses are socialized.
Where the U.S. has perhaps suffered from some public relations problems in the past, in very poor and hungry places, it doesn't look good to them either to know that Americans are basically putting corn in their fuel tanks. And meanwhile, they're lucky if they get, a meal a day or 2 meals a day.
For the European members of NATO to free ride on the U.S. security guarantee now for nearly 6 decades. And they have become very comfortable doing that.
If she wants to blame somebody, she can go down the hall and blame Ben Bernanke, because the main reason you're seeing this big surge in price is because market actors are afraid that the Fed has given up the ghost on inflation, and they're parking their money in commodity futures to hedge against inflation and to hedge against risk in equity markets. You're seeing a boom in commodity prices across the board, whether we're talking about copper, oil, coal, gasoline, it doesn't matter. Commodity prices are going crazy, largely as a response to Fed policy. It's not the big oil companies. If it were, then you'd expect to see low oil prices in other parts of the world where the big oil companies aren't, and you don't. You see a generalized increase in global crude oil prices because the big oil companies are price takers. They're not price setters.
The problem is these groups are focused on the mom and apple pie aspects of it. They're trying to avoid the sort of hardcore philosophical debate over how to fix the system.
Only 2 people who know exactly what is happening is Morgan Tsvangirai and Robert Mugabe.
Capitalism without losses is like religion without hell. People who believe in free markets don't believe that markets can do no wrong. As a matter of fact, that's part of the market. People make mistakes, and that's exactly why I don't think there should be bailouts, because when there are bailouts, you distort those signals, and people don't learn from mistakes. And when the government comes in with the bailouts, it's telling people in the future, go ahead and take greater risk because the government will be there to pick up the pieces.
I think Senator Obama is trying to do is to take away the initiative from Senator McCain to be able to brand him as a neophyte.
Ed Crane of the libertarian Cato Institute says the collapse of Fannie and Freddie was bound to happen, and the bailout isn't the answer.
Well, it's a bad idea because it's making the American taxpayers pay for mistakes that bureaucrats have made at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This kind of explicit socialism is a huge mistake on the part of the federal government. We should privatize Fannie Mae, privatize Freddie Mac, and get on with it.
First of all, it's not that farmers are gaining from this. Corn farmers are growing, but of course hog farmers and ranchers, they're suffering, as are consumers and consumers around the world. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it will go anywhere near towards this so-called energy independence that we're trying to aim for.
Many little companies don't earn profits. Many of the smaller companies are startups. There's a lot of companies are new companies, and no one expects new companies to make profits.
We've grown to view the president as somebody who can get the country moving again, who can heal up the nation's wounds, teach your children well, basically as a combination guardian angel, national nanny, and supreme warlord of the earth. And it couldn't be further from what the framers intended.
Supreme Court decision expected to be handed down as early as Monday, which is likely to
cast as a major decision that really takes a whack at defining exactly what that Second Amendment
means. They have the most gun crimes, yet they have the most gun control, which shows you gun control doesn't work.
In a historic 5-4 decision last week, the High Court overturned the 32-year-old ban on handguns.
The United States Constitution says that the people in Washington, D.C. have a right to keep and bear arms. The people in Washington, D.C. have been denied that right. Our Constitution has served us well for 2 1/4 centuries. We have to treat it as if it's made of something more than tissue paper.
But, William, I do want to give a last word to you. I mean, he's basically saying the government should be in the business of encouraging home ownership.
No.